First of all, thank you for the invitation for this discussion. The theme will be the ecclesiastical text of the Bible, of the Old Testament and of the New Testament. I'm very pleased to announce you the presence of Professor Felix Albright, of monk Filotheu Bălan, which is also very interested in this problem, of the renowned Professor Sysse Engberg from Copenhagen, which is the editor of the Prophetologion, and also Catherine Mary MacRobert. I can see here Mary MacRobert, Sysse Engberg. Hello, nice to meet you and to have you here. First of all, I would like to explain what we understand through this ecclesiastical text. What is our concern? What is our question? And I will start by defining this ecclesiastical text, by a text which is read and used in the Greek-speaking church, so in the Byzantine church. And my question will be, of course, how can we define, how can we find, how can we make a profile of this ecclesiastical text? And of course, we will find many variations, many different readings. And my question will be, can we make a hierarchy of these variants? Can we find a specific Byzantine type for the biblical text? For the New Testament, it's a little bit easier because we have a critical edition, the so-called Byzantine text, or the majority text. In 2005, there was a critical edition published by Robinson and Pierpont. So it's possible to have a glimpse of this standard Byzantine text type. For the Old Testament, the problem is a little bit more difficult because in the Orthodox Church, in the Eastern Church, we have only a small percent of biblical text used in the liturgical ritual, in the cult. So perhaps 10%, 15%, I'm not for sure, but perhaps in the 8th or 9th century, a new liturgical book was born, and this is the Prophetologion. Professor Engberg could explain us better. And this book means that not all the books of the Old Testament are read. Not all the books of the Old Testament are used. For example, there are many books which are completely out of use. I think that only the book of Jonah is entirely read in the Byzantine cult, but otherwise many texts are completely unknown. I'm quoting James Miller, who suggests that this Prophetologion is actually the Old Testament of Byzantine Christianity. If this is correct, and I fear that it is correct, it's a little bit disappointing for us that only a small percent of the Old Testament is used in the church. I suppose that standardization of the biblical text occur. When exactly? Father Filotheu Bălan will give us some information. And how can we consider this standard Byzantine text? Let me give you only this glimpse. Speaking about the publishing phenomenon, which for the Greek text is a little bit complicated. Why? Because under the Ottoman rule, it was forbidden to publish in Greek. That's why the first Bible which was published in Greek by the Orthodox was actually outside Greece, outside the Ottoman Empire. And this occurred in Venice in 1687. And we must add that this was a project started by Romanian voivode, Șerban Cantacuzino, and it's actually a double project. He published a Greek Bible and also a Romanian Bible, a Romanian translation of the whole Bible, and this was actually the first Bible in Romania. Which text was used for this project? It was actually republished of the Frankfurt Bible, which has many Catholic influences, and also which has some Protestant influences, because all the books which were not found in the Septuagint were grouped at the end as apocrypha. So as this term is used in the Protestant milieu. The second Bible in Greek, sponsored by the Orthodox, was the Moscow Bible in 1821, and this was possible after the Greek Revolution. There were some brothers, some Greek brothers, Zosimas brothers, who published this project in Moscow. And the text used for the Old Testament was actually the Codex Alexandrinus, but as was published by Grabe in the 8th century. So published by a German scholar. And what was interesting is that they published also the small glosses inserted by Grabe. So this was not actually the Codex Alexandrinus, but the Codex Alexandrinus with many insertions into the text. Then this Moscow Bible was republished many times in Greece. In 1928, the theological brotherhood called Zoe, Life, which was actually a brotherhood composed of laymen, but also a small percentage of priests, published another edition following Tischendorf's critical text, published in Leipzig. This was another direction in searching for what we can call the ecclesiastical text. And another step was the publish in 1939 by the same Zoe Brotherhood in Athens of a Septuagint with Ralph's critical text, which appeared in 1935, in which Professor Panayotis Bratsiotis, professor of Old Testament studies, replaced some biblical passages with the readings taken from the liturgical books. So actually it was an influence, if I may say that, an influence of the Prophetologion over the actual text of the Septuagint. It was a mishmash and confusion, I must say, but let us think a little bit if this principle, if this methodology is correct, or is it could gain some arguments, some support, some supports from this search of the ecclesiastical text. I must say that this edition marked also the switch from the focus on the Alexandrinus for the Old Testament to the Vaticanus, and this choice was followed by the other edition up until the final edition of the Septuagint, published by the Orthodox Church in Greece, which is in 1997 published by the Apostolic Diaconia. So remember, first was the focus on the Codex Alexandrinus, and then through this edition in 1939, it was the switch to the Vaticanus. And my question is, can we find some directions in this search? Can we find some answers regarding the ecclesiastical text? Question number one, is the Byzantine text published in the critical edition of Robinson and Pierpont? It is suitable for a real Byzantine text. Why? Because in Greek-speaking churches, there are also influences from the Textus Receptus, which appear through Reformation in the Middle Ages. So actually in the Greek-speaking church, there is not a pure preservation of the Byzantine text. So it could be a difference between the real Byzantine text and what we should call the ecclesiastical text. And the problem is of course more difficult for the Old Testament. For the Old Testament, I just give up. Old Testament is completely out of order. So I dare to put these questions, and I try to find some answers from you. What would be this text, this standard text used by the church? Of course, there are many versions, so perhaps it's better to speak about many versions of this ecclesiastical text. But also I have spoken with Father Filotheu. There was a standardization. Some people think that this standardization appeared in Constantinople, in Studion Monastery. Also, there is a theory that also the Prophetologion appeared as an product of the Studion Monastery. Is it correct? Is it correct that the standard ecclesiastical text appear in 9th century, 10th century or so? So, because Professor Brock will leave us soon, I just want to put this question about the standard ecclesiastical text to him. What do you think, Professor Brock?
You have put the problem very well. I hadn't realized that it's actually even more complicated than I thought. I suppose one could gain some idea from the editions of the Göttingen Septuaginta, because there you see the actual manuscript evidence, and one could locate, at least for certain books, a group of manuscripts which one could describe perhaps as the ecclesiastical or Byzantine text. But because I was always interested in the earlier stages of the Septuagint textual history, I have not given thought to this particular problem. I must say, in many ways, one needs to work book by book, because even in the oldest manuscripts, for example, Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, each book is apt to have a different textual character, and sometimes it's radically different, and that needs to be taken into account. So I guess one needs to have, as it were, Byzantine editions of individual books, and only then, basing oneself on the very large manuscript tradition that exists, and only then, as it were, let the Byzantine text emerge from the evidence of these editions. But that's a task, a big task for the future.
One question, if you permit, it would it be possible to make up a critical ecclesiastical text for the Old Testament, starting from the critical edition of Professor Engberg of the Prophetologion? So, is it correct to start from the liturgical use of the text?
I suppose that could be a possibility, in that for the books that are in the Prophetologion, one could see what their textual character is, looking against the critical editions from the Septuaginta of Göttingen, and then that would, as it were, identify the sort of texts which were accepted as liturgically suitable at a particular time. But of course, that's going to limit you to a very small number of books. So personally, I think it would be, in the long run, it would be more suitable to have editions of individual books based on a selection of manuscripts from the sort of formative Byzantine period. It's not an impossible task. One would perhaps need to do some experiment in the selection of manuscripts, but I wouldn't have thought it's needed to have, as it were, all the manuscripts available. That would be, in my view, rather a waste of time for this purpose, that is. But I'm sure there are better solutions.
Okay, thank you. It would be very interesting what Professor Sysse Engberg will say. But Father Filotheu has a question.
For Professor Brock. I saw some lectionaries with Syriac text that correspond to old Syriac translations from the 2nd, 3rd centuries.
And the sound isn't very good.
I saw some lectionaries, Syriac lectionaries,
yes,
containing the old translations into Syriac, I mean Coretonian, Sinaitic, and so forth, for the New Testament. Are there, is it the same with, I don't know, maybe you saw, the same with the lectionaries for the Old Testament, for Prophetologion? Do they use the first Syriac translation, or some of the others?
No, normally for the Old Testament they would use the Peshitta, but there are quite a number of passages which are from the Syro-Hexapla, from the 7th century version, and it's also, one needs to remember that in the Syriac lectionary tradition, there is a huge variety. There's no single system like the Prophetologion. There are many different systems in the Middle Ages. It's only in modern times that there is, as it were, an official lectionary. And in fact, the Syrian Orthodox Church is currently producing a new lectionary. So I think the situation is rather different from that of the Greek tradition.
Okay, thank you. Professor Sysse Engberg, are you online?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Okay, thank you.
I
Yes.
can hardly hear you. Your voice is very weak. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay.
Please share with us some of your experience in editing the Prophetologion. What would you think? What is the ecclesiastical text viewed from the Prophetologion edition?
May I start somewhere else? And just a comment to the Syriac lectionaries. The Greek Prophetologion has been translated into Syriac. So for the Melkite churches. So there's this a part of the tradition, I guess. I don't know if there are any influences from this Syriac Prophetologion on the other traditions of the Syriac Old Testament. I hadn't really studied it. I have done a little bit of work on Syriac Prophetologia with Gregory Kessel, but it will have to wait because it's a very large task. If I may say something about my esteemed colleague Mihăilă, he has not done research on the Prophetologium. He writes from other sources, some of which are really outdated. And the idea of the Studion was thrown out by Høgen Sons back in the early 20th century, and there's no foundation for that at all. I finished the edition of the Prophetologium, which started, the first volume came out the year I was born, so I wasn't part of that. But I made the last 3 fascicles out, the last 3 volumes out of 8, which are the volumes with the most variety, because it's the Pentecostarian part and the Mineralogian part. And there's really very great variety in that part of the book. Whereas the first part that covers Lent is much more stable and homogeneous in many ways. But this work made me wonder. Pardon?
Just for the audience,
Yes.
the first part was published during the 30s by Professor Günther Zunz and
Carsten Høeg and Günther Zunz.
And in the 80s, you finished the critical edition of the Prophetologion.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
outdated, so to say, in the Orthodox cult, but we have all the components scattered around other liturgical books. For example, in the Menaya, in the Triodion, in the Pentecostarion. It's what we call paremiar or paremiarnik in the Slavic or Romanian tradition. So the paremiar is actually this Prophetologion. It contains all the readings which are taken from the Old Testament and is used in the Byzantine cult. Thank you. Please continue.
Well, thank you for this. Well, Dosofsky calls it parimile in his translation from the 17th century. And he actually uses the word Prophetologion. This is the first occurrence we have of the title Prophetologion, which he explains as parimile, parimenic. So I must say that I don't agree with very much of what is said normally about the Prophetologium. To my mind, it was not created in the 9th century. It was not created in one go, which, and if you read what Sons, especially Sons, has written about this, it's really surreal, sort of, because you don't create a liturgical book in that way. You set up a committee and create a liturgical book. It's an anachronistic thought, to my mind. On the other hand, you have, and Alfred Ralphs already has pointed out that already in around the year 400, you have reading of Genesis, the first book of the Pentateuch, during Lent, on the weekdays of Lent. And if you study his comments to these readings, of course you can't see a system of reading behind this, but if you go to his contemporary, Severian of Gabala, who actually preached in Constantinople around the year 400, there you can see a pattern that corresponds very nicely to part of the pattern of reading that is in the Prophesiologium and during all the tradition. I mean, it seems that this part, the Genesis reading in pericopes, in sections, read in a sort of pseudo lectio continua, where you read the whole book, but with large omissions. This was perhaps already in place in Constantinople by then.
Yes, I completely agree. This was actually only the, so to say, the official, the classical and outdated theory about the origin of the Prophetologion. Of course, the history of Prophetologion is much more complicated. But what do you think? Is it okay to start from the Prophetologion in searching this ecclesiastical text?
That depends on what you mean by ecclesiastical text. Because if you look at what was recited in Hagia Sophia, in the cathedral rite in Constantinople, that is the Prophetologium, to my mind, starting out from a small nucleus and growing slowly over the centuries. So that is the ecclesiastical text for the readings. And the readings were very important. I mean, it was kind of authoritative text that was recited very slowly and with ekphonesis and so on. And as you say, it's only part of the Old Testament that is recited, but it's not all that. I mean, for some books, the Genesis, for instance, about 40% of Genesis is read during Lent and outside of Lent. And about a third of Isaiah is read as well during Lent. And almost 70% of Proverbs is read during Lent. Then, of course, the whole book of Jonah, and then it becomes more scattered, obviously. But for that body of text, I feel very certain that this was the text that was recited in the Hagia Sophia. So if that is what you're after, that's the text you should choose. Perhaps not the edition, though, because, well, maybe one could start with the edition, I don't know, but the edition is a little bit tricky.
Have you studied what kind of recension was used for the Prophetologion? I mean, for the Old Testament, we know that the Septuagint knew many revision. Yeah. And did you study what kind of text was used for the Prophetologion?
I have not systematically compared the Prophetologian text to the Septuagint. My project was a different one. I wanted to describe the history, the tradition of this liturgical book, the Prophetologian. But I've done it in pieces, and there is an American scholar, Erickson, who has compared the text from Isaiah, from 20 Prophetologia on Sinai, with Septuagint. but I haven't done anything of that sort. I mean, a systematic comparison, but the text in general is Lucianic, I suppose. One should say, and then there's a question of Daniel, of course, where it's mainly Theologian, probably, but that's a different question. Anyway, my point is really with it.
I should add also that for the book of Job, we have this insertion made by Origen, which also proved that the text was not a pure Septuagint, but a Septuagint with insertion made by Origen. So it's the Septuagint with the asterisk material, which became the text used for the pericope in Prophetologion.
As you say, it's all very complicated, which is why I haven't started this research at all, because I have just this one life, and others must do this. I can't do everything. But what I think I can show is that the Prophetologion grew slowly, and once a text is in the Prophetologion, it remains very stable. So you do have a tradition, but we cannot really.
This is an important issue, because by this standardization, you mean that all the other variations are out. Yeah? So
not necessarily. For instance, South Italian Prophetologia tend to perhaps use a different tradition in some places. Which is why the Prophetologion is difficult to use, because it tries to show everything. It shows too much. And if you include the South Italian manuscripts, which you are tempted to do because they are dated and they are 10th century, but in some respects, their text traditions seem to be different from the Hagia Sophia one. And also, I mean, once the, say, the Genesis readings, unfortunately, we don't have Genesis in the Vaticanus, because the Vaticanus was used liturgically. There are lection marks that it was used for reciting Isaiah in the church and other parts of other pericopes. But where they took the original text from, I think one could find out by studying the Lenten part of Genesis and Proverbs, probably, because I think Proverbs must be almost as old. I mean, the reading of Proverbs must be almost as old as that of Genesis. But then other texts are chosen and recited, like Isaiah, as I believe, with Karabinov and Kniazev and other people, were due to Heraclius. So this is early 7th century.
7th century.
Yes. So were they taken from the same manuscripts as were Genesis and Proverbs? What manuscripts did they have in the Patriarchate, in Hagia Sophia? We don't know that. And then even later texts are added in the 10th, 11th century, and then it stops. Then the lections are reused. You don't find new texts, but just reuse those that are already there. But they must have had, one can't imagine that they didn't have a full Septuagint, as full Pentext in a Patriarchate. They must have had it. But then we have liturgical notes that between services, there is what is called proanagnosis, which is kind of free reading, which could be from the Old Testament, but they don't give details. They just say proanagnosis ectis palias. And so which manuscripts did they have for that? And they probably had several manuscripts with single books or just the Pentateuch or single prophets or something like that. One can only imagine what they had. And that's what, but we know that they, we know at least that the body of the Prophesiologium is, at least I know, I'm sure, I'm certain, I hope I can persuade everybody else, that the body of the Prophesiologium originated in Hagia Sophia and remained fairly stable over the centuries, and is found even in the printed Menea from the 19th century. But the Greeks did not seek out those texts when they printed a Prophesiologium in the late 20th century, but they printed the standard one. I mean, they didn't use their own tradition. There is a printed Prophesiologium printed in Venice in 1567.
This was the first edition.
I think there was a one before that we haven't, that hasn't been, that we don't have, that has been lost. But I think there was another one printed in Italy also in 1545, because we have a manuscript that is copied from as a copy of this printed book. So there were at least two printed Prophesiologia. And then, of course, as you say, the texts sort of go into Menea, Triodia, Pentecostaria, and are lost, almost forgotten.
Okay, thank you.
So it's a very closed tradition, really, and you could use that, but you will get a very specific thing. Only the readings that were recited in Hagia Sophia, and then in all the Chalcedonian churches. After.
Do you think it's safe to apply the reading from the Prophetologion upon the critical edition of the Septuagint, as the Greek did in 1939 through Professor Bratsiotis?
How's that to rely on?
So they took out the readings from the Prophetologion and they apply them to Ralph's edition. And
oh yes, but only in a few places, as I understood you. Or was
yes,
it?
It was a composed Bible, so to say. So
Yeah.
Ralph's edition with the readings from the Prophetologion.
Well, that is a little odd thing to do. I think the Prophetologion is a separate edition, and in a critical edition, you can refer to the Prophetologian tradition in the critical apparatus, for instance. But you shouldn't. I don't think you should just take and mix it with Ralph's. I don't believe that anything good comes out of that.
Okay. Thank you for your discussion. Professor Mary MacRobert, what do you think? Can you join us?
Here I am.
What do you think about the search of...
What I can contribute to this discussion is, of course, indirect. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Because I don't work directly on the Greek tradition, but on the Slavonic translated tradition. What I think I find there is that there are several slightly different versions of the Psalter, textually speaking. Naturally, there are the versions that are accompanied by commentary, the commentary of Hesychius, the commentary of Theodoret, Cyrus. And these go way back, and they have some, not very many, but some distinctive readings. And then there are the there's the tradition of the liturgical and devotional Psalter, the Psalter used or drawn on for church services, but also used for private devotion, especially though not exclusively by monks. And there, the difficulty from my point of view is that revisers went back to Greek, of course. They took a version of the Book of Psalms in Greek that was current or even authoritative at their time, and they corrected their translation to bring it in line with that version. And each time you get a new revision, which is well attested, you can see that it reflects a small number of distinctive readings in Greek. The problem is that the further back you go in the Slavonic tradition, the less clear things are, because we go to the first translation. A gap of probably at least 200 years separates the first translation of the Psalter into Church Slavonic and the manuscripts which we actually have. And in that time, there must have been many copyings. Probably there were people who checked against Greek. And so the early part of the tradition is more complicated, textually speaking, than the later traditions. When you get to the 14th century, we have manuscripts which were written very soon after a new revision, and they agree with each other. But the early manuscripts are much less homogeneous. It has been suggested that some of the distinctive readings in the early manuscripts may actually come from a Western, either Latin or Greek, but Western Greek tradition. My position on that is agnostic. I think there are complications about that. What I think one can say is that as time goes on, the choice of variants which must go back to Greek, which are not simply the result of translation from Greek into Slavonic, but are genuine Greek variants, comes more and more in line with what Ralphs labels the Lucianic tradition. So I think that there is a movement towards something which, for the Psalter, at least in Ralph's time, could be called Lucianic. But even so, in the 14th century, in the different revisions which you emerge in the 14th century, you do get some differences that probably go back to Greek. So it is genuinely difficult, I think, to talk about one Byzantine Greek liturgical type for the Psalter. Rather, I think at different times one has very slightly different types, which presumably replace each other. And by the time you get to the early 16th century and you get printed books, you have Maxime Theodoros, for instance, Maxime the Greek, who worked first of all in Italy and later in Athos time. And he produced a bilingual version of the Psalter, Church Slavonic, revised against a Greek version of his time, which is slightly different again from what obviously underlies the revisions of the 14th century. So it really is complicated, I'm afraid, again. And I think if you wanted to have a standard Byzantine liturgical version of the Psalter, again, you would need to have a critical apparatus, and you might want to decide which period of time you were interested in, whether you were interested in the standard of the 14th century or the 16th century, or, so far as you can discern it, the 10th to 11th centuries. This is not a cheerful conclusion, I'm sorry.
What do you think about the Jewish influence upon these Slavonic translations of the Bible?
Well, I think some Jewish influence has been demonstrated in the 16th century. I am not aware of earlier Jewish influence. I see no reason to suppose direct Jewish influence in the case of the Psalter. It's quite likely that St. Cyril knew Jewish. It's much less likely, I think, that the subsequent revisers did so. And I would be surprised myself if St. Cyril had particularly worried about the Jewish version of the Psalter, because after all, the Septuagint had its own status, and I would have expected him to start from the Septuagint.
Okay, thank you. One
But
more
perhaps I'm wrong.
question. What do you think about the standardization of the biblical text if you view this from the Slavonic tradition? Is there a standardization in the Slavonic tradition?
I mean, there are repeated.
Is it quest of the standard ecclesiastical text in the Slavonic tradition?
Oh, definitely. And this is what lies behind these revisions. You have a translation which is used for a number of generations, copied manually, of course, copied in manuscripts. And in the process of copying, obvious mistakes creep in. Sometimes the copyists what is in Greek and try to improve their text a little bit. But the result of this uncoordinated copying is that the manuscripts come to disagree with each other more and more. They certainly seem to have thought this in the early 14th century. And people who have sufficient authority, it's thought perhaps people on Athos, organize as thorough for a time authoritative. But as long as you have manuscript tradition rather than printed books, it's very difficult to maintain that authoritative text unaltered. So it's really when print comes in that you get an authoritative standard text which continues unaltered. And the interesting thing there is that in the South Slav lands, there was one version of the Psalter, a little bit later, in the 16th century, in the East Slav lands, with the help of print, you get the institution of an authoritative version of the Psalter, which is different from what the South Slavs are using.
Okay, thank you. We can see someone who is connected by the simple name video. So I don't know, is it Professor Felix Albrecht? Or please reveal yourself, Mr. Video.
It may be me.
No. You appear as Sysse Engberg.
Do we have a picture of me? Because if I stop video,
I'm not sure. So,
did it stop? Did it disappear?
No.
Oh.
There seems to be two complete different persons. Father Filotheu, please feel free to join our discussion. And then
may I ask something about the Slavic Psalter?
Yes, please.
Of course, I should have said that the tradition of the Psalter and the rest of the Old Testament are completely different. In Hagia Sophia, the Psalter was never read, only sung. So it gives a different tradition, I suppose, with a sung text, which you remember perhaps in different ways than you do the recited text. Also, the Psalter was recited very often, and the Old Testament readings came just once a year for most of them. But the question I wanted to ask is, was there a tradition for using the Psalter to teaching people to read in Slavonic and Romanian society? Because that remained in Greek society up until the 19th century. And so very many people knew the Psalter by heart, or large parts of the Psalter by heart. And that influenced, of course, the tradition, must have influenced the tradition and made it even more complicated, I suppose.
If I may attempt an answer to that, yes, the Psalter was used for educational purposes in the same way, the Slavonic Psalter in the same way as among the Greeks. In addition, of course, it was recited as part of private devotions, particularly in monastic circles. It was used as a fortune-telling book, in addition. So there were several ways, apart from the purely liturgical familiarity with the Psalter, in which people came to know the Psalms very well indeed. And this, as you say, does complicate the tradition, because what you find, you can see this already in the critical apparatus to Ralph's edition of the Psalter, but you see it very frequently in the Slavonic tradition, is that copyists operate partly by memory, and they confuse places in the Psalter that are similar with each other. They transpose phrases from one psalm to another because of textual similarities. And this is quite a significant complicating factor in the textual tradition.
Okay, thank you. Now I invite Father Filotheu Bălan, who has something also to say.
Yes, Professor Sebastian Brock just said earlier that there are in the Syriac manuscripts that also belong to different ecclesiastical jurisdictions. There are different traditions, and we cannot know for sure which kind of text belong to which kind of ecclesiastical jurisdiction. So we might suppose that the same thing happened in the Greek world around the Mediterranean Sea. So that is my first observation. We might find in the manuscripts and in fragments of manuscripts remains of different textual traditions for the lectionaries in the Old and of the Old and New Testament. From what we talked to this point, there is one conclusion. I'm sorry to start with the conclusion that we need a Byzantine edition of the Old Testament, and the recent Göttingen edition of Septuagint is not helping very much for this, only to point out some different lections, but not always pointing out that those lections belong to the Byzantine text. And earlier this day, Professor Sebastian Brock pointed out, also talked about the last main Syriac translation of the New Testament, the Harklean translations, made in the second decade of the 7th century AD, near Alexandria. That also shows that in that moment, at the beginning of the 7th century, and we might suppose that it was also true for the centuries before, the Byzantine text was the standard text of the Alexandrian Church, not only for the Constantinople and Antioch. So we might suppose that the Byzantine text was also the standard text for the lectionaries after the years 400, 500 AD. Also, there are some things to understand about what happened in Constantinople after the year 800 AD. and also before that, we all supposedly know that the minuscule writing replaced the old uncial writing. So that happened because of the influence that the books of studied monks from the Studion Monastery were adopted by almost every. So from this point of view, Studion Monastery should be one of the most important influences after the era of Saint Theodore the Studied. And this can be seen also in Palestine, as Daniel Galața showed some years ago with his studies about the Byzantinization of the Palestinian Church that started in the same era at the beginning of the 9th century. And it is also true for the other churches, even if they remain small churches, I mean Alexandria and Antioch. These are my observations to be made. And if we need standard text for the lectionaries, either for the Old Testament, either for the New Testament, we should take into account the standard of the Byzantine text after the 6th century AD.
Thank you. So I invite everybody who is present here to join our discussion, either by questions or by direct intervention. So if someone wants to join our discussion.
Thank you very much for organizing this roundtable, and very important question.
A little bit louder.
Louder, okay. Thank you very much for organizing this roundtable, and this is very important question for all of us. First of all, do we talk about ecclesiastical text or liturgical text? If we think about ecclesiastical text, I think that every book that is accepted and allowed to be used in the church for the liturgy and also for the personal reading, it's ecclesiastical. But if we have in mind liturgical text, I mean the text that is used during the services in the church, so we have to limit this. And in this distinction, we also have to think about the book of Revelation, which belongs to the New Testament, because it was used sometimes in Orthodox tradition during the liturgies. Serbian manuscripts for the 14th century prove that it was used during the liturgies. I have no idea about Greek tradition or East Slavonic tradition. Sorry, I need to use my glasses. What concerns the Byzantine edition text of the New Testament published by Pierpont Morgan, as far as I know, there is a limited number of the lectionaries used. In Greek tradition, it is not only Tetraevangelion with the liturgical rubrics, but also a huge number of liturgical texts not only for Gospels, but also for the Apostles. So we also have to keep in mind this tradition of the text that was researched to some extent by Chicago lectionary program in the middle of the previous century. Prophetologion. In Slavonic tradition, it is called parimeinik, because most of the no, I don't want to talk about the name.
Reading comes from the Book of Proverbs.
Yeah. But should we treat some fragments that were taken from the chronics of historical books or from meander, because in Slavonic tradition, in the Prophetologion, there are some fragments from these two books. Is it ecclesiastical text? Is it a liturgical text? Yeah. Yeah. Syriac tradition and Old Greek tradition. During my first trip to St. Katrina Monastery to research Slavonic Gospel manuscripts, I also asked for the Greek, the oldest lectionaries. And what was interesting that there are some Greek lectionaries dated to the late 9th or early 10th century that they don't show us, they don't confirm a Byzantine liturgical tradition, but the local one. And there are also, as far as I know, at least 2 manuscripts that confirm the mixed tradition. Some of the lectionary follows the Palestine tradition and another one follows the Byzantine. So it is the witness of the period that on the turn from the Old into the Byzantine tradition. Yeah, and also we have to think that we have to bear in mind that we have at least in Slavonic tradition several types of at least I can say about the gospel text, because we have a liturgical text which is confirmed by Tetra Evangelia and lectionaries. We have text for personal reading, and we have a text also with the explanation, with the commentaries. So, a lot of different texts, not used only for the liturgy, but for the personal reading and also for the teaching of the catechumens. A lot of problems, and I think it's very interesting, very important, and we must organize a lot of conferences devoted to this different small topics. Thank you.
Thank you. And I completely agree. In defining this ecclesiastical text, we must take into account the fact that the biblical text could be also used in personal devotion. So if I want to have a Bible, but this is actually the question, if I want to have a Byzantine Bible, which text should I have as a reading text?
Your observation about differences between ecclesiastical and church texts is very important, because as we showed earlier, if we have different traditions, Palestinian, Constantinopolitan, and so forth, we have also different traditions inside the Constantinopolitan tradition itself. So, Church Slavonic tradition is one of the branches, and it is very important from this point of view, and it comes with the saints Kirill and Methodius in the second half of the 9th century. And I can also add that they brought not only these type of texts, these branches of text, but they brought also some musical notation that survived only in the Slavonic milieu.
Okay. Please feel free to
Could I comment?
Yes, please.
I forgot to stress that.
Please turn on your camera because we can't see you.
Oh, is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good. If you want the authoritative text of Hagia Sophia of Constantinople for the Old Testament, parts of the Old Testament, you have the Prophesiologium. And there's not very much variation in that. What variation there is not geographical, but chronological. It's variation over time, but in the same place in Constantinople, according to my belief. But the complete manuscripts we have are from the 10th century, really. But we do have two manuscripts that represent an earlier tradition before the Isaiah readings were added in Lent. Unfortunately, both palimpsest and very difficult to read, but it would be very interesting to know whether the text in these two is the same as it is in the later ones. So your question about standardization, there might have been a standardization at some point. We cannot know, but if we can read these two, we might be a little bit wiser as to the answer to that. And then Studion, just another comment. There's a lot of talk of Prophesiologium and influence from Palestine and so on and so forth. But the point is that in spite of the fact that there is liturgical influence from Palestine starting perhaps earlier than we normally thought, it does not affect the lections. The lections in the Prophesiologium remain the same, unaltered by changes in the liturgical setting.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Contac.
I, of course, watch this debate from the outside because this is not a concern which is particularly present in a Protestant context. But my question from the outside would be, what would be the objective which you would seek? Is there the idea of actually obtaining a critical edition at some point? Because to me it seems obvious that there is a wide diversity in the same place across time, and also wide diversity of readings, of variations across geographical space. And at the same time there is a force of tradition and the center of authority which radiates across a certain area. And then the question is, well, there is of course not a single ecclesiastical text or ecclesial text, but a diversity of ecclesiastical texts. And now what? Is there should there be an attempt to actually establish a critical edition? And then the question is, what should be the criteria to use in an attempt to distill a possible critical edition reflecting a certain period? Because I don't think you could ultimately go back to an original, since you have so many various traditions. So in a sense, to me, it's like trying to square the circle. Like, how can we get to a standard text, but at the same time realizing that it's impossible to actually get to a standard text?
My point is that if I try to use the critical edition of Ralphs and Hannart or the Göttingen edition, I got this problem. This is not this follows not the same methodology as I'm tried to. Why? Because they are searching for the earliest text. But my point is I'm searching for something different. I'm searching for a standard text which was supposed to function in the Byzantine Church. And I try to understand, and you're right, this is also this question of criteria. I'm trying to understand which criteria should I use for finding this standard text. From which period? Father Filotheu says that after 800 or 900, and there are some arguments for this standard text after this time. So this is my concern. This is my concern about having an why not a critical edition of the Byzantine tradition, which is more which is easier in the New Testament, but a little bit more complicated regarding the Old Testament. That's why we have this discussion. Please feel free to intervene if you have something to say.
Some in the last centuries there were critical editions for the patristic texts, and they are very important also from the scriptural point of view, because not all the manuscripts of the fathers present the same text, and you can see revisions and yes, revisions made by scribes during the ages, and if we find differences in one author, we should use them as a testimony for some changes that happened during that era when scribes operated these changes, and we are compelled to use also patristic testimonies from the scriptural point of view. And going back to the question of our colleague from Poland, there are three types of New Testament and Old Testament manuscripts. The first type is the text as it is. The second one, there are the lectionaries, and the third one, there are the collections of catene, and all of these three should be taken into account when we are searching for a standard text.
And I should add something else, also the quotation from the church fathers or theologians. Yeah? Okay.
Can I add a few ideas? If you allow me, just a few ideas from different angles. For instance, you started from the idea of an agreement between the Prophetologion and the Bible, an entire Bible. But the first problem is that, for instance, in Romanian, we had an entire Bible before having a service in the vernacular. So our Bible was an Orthodox Bible, and it was a standard Bible without any official service in the Romanian. Besides, and even in the New Testament, we have the Revelation, which is never read in the Bible, and yet the New Testament also includes the Revelation. And I don't know why you should you equal a liturgical Bible with an Orthodox Bible. I mean, I don't see. It would be easier, of course. Even when I was in Spain, I don't know Spanish. I tried to buy a Bible which is read in the liturgy, because I thought that would be the standard. But they say we have a lot of other Bibles that we read, and maybe the problem will be solved by the time. I mean, there is a lot of historical hazard in this. For instance, our current synodal Bible was shaped by a patriarch which was not quite a biblical scholar at all. And he did it, and we use it even now. On the other side, we have the Antimus example, who was a martyr, and who shaped the Psalter, which is pretty same Psalter like today. And I think I'm not sure I'm a very I have a very obvious order, but maybe we are looking for an illusion, I mean, a chimera, I mean, a consensus between the fathers and the liturgical texts. There's not such a thing. And even in
no, the question is, can I find something similar to the Byzantine text of the New Testament in the Old Testament? So there is a critical edition of the Byzantine text for the New Testament. Okay, is it possible to get a similar critical edition for the Old Testament, for the entire Bible?
The critical doesn't mean standard. I mean, the critical edition is not a standard. It's not a liturgical. You cannot read in the church a critical edition. I mean,
Yes, you're right.
And in 2023, I don't think we can have a Bible without footnotes. I mean, it's too late for have it. Maybe in the first century they had such a traditional text by chance. I know there was another epoch. Now we know that it happened. That
Please speak into the mic and a little bit louder.
My paper tomorrow will focus on this topic also in some points. My opinion is we have the old manuscripts, the Vaticanus and Alexandrus and the Sinaiticus, and we have all the research performed by all the honest scholars. I mean, there is not such a thing, orthodox scholarship in Bible fields. I mean, you have to look at every research if it has a proselytizing agenda, secret agenda, and if it is so, you see, and you don't rely on that research. But otherwise, this is a field where all denominations can contribute, and we should.
Yes and no, because, for example, it is I feel very comfortable with your point, but in the Catholic Church, there was such a quest after the Authentica edition. And this is actually the Nova Vulgata now. It was the old Vulgata and then Nova Vulgata. So this quest is, I think, is legitimate. It's a good quest. Is there an ecclesiastical text in the East? Of course, the question is, which criteria should I use in searching this kind of text?
Maybe the time will decide.
I just wanted to point out that maybe the structure of authority not being the same, it would be difficult to attempt something along the lines of a Nova Vulgata, because you have the popes who want to publish a Septuagint or a critical edition of whatever, and they decree that, and then there is an effort in that direction, and of course it's not perfect, but it's still a kind of a central authority, which is, I think, a bit different, and maybe trying to attempt that within the, let's say, province of Byzantine studies would be difficult. But I would still have a question. The the Romanian version which you published under the auspices of Vatoped Monastery, is that a critical kind of text, the Greek text, or is just a manuscript which was adopted as the source text?
Actually, this has as a basis the edition of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which appeared in 1904. It was prepared by Professor Antoniadis, but this was actually obtained after searching 100 manuscripts. So the search basis was not so great, but it was an attempt supported by the Orthodox Church in having to have a standard Byzantine text.
And does it differ much in that regard from the critical edition, let's say the
Yes, I can give you an example. For example, Coma Ioanneum is present as an influence from the Textus Receptus, or from the Eastern tradition, because it's older. And this Coma Ioanneum is present in the Patriarchate edition, but is not present in the Byzantine text published by Robertson and Pierpont. So it's not part of the critical edition of. And this is only one example. There are many. I think it's dozens of little examples where there are some differences between the critical edition of the Byzantine text and the Vatoped edition. This 904 edition was republished until today, for example, in the Vatoped monasteries and in Holy Mountain.
I just wanted only to this Antoniadis edition. When the Chicago lectionary project was at the stage of preparing, they compared the edition of Antoniadis with Textus Receptus, and probably in the first volume there is an enumeration of differences that concern the Gospel books. So this work was done, and for sure there are a lot of differences in this text. And Antoniadis, probably as one of the first Greek scholars, also included about 20 Greek lectionaries for preparing this edition, because in 19th century lectionaries were mostly disregarded and no one wanted to use them.
Yes, I say that his method was safe, but he had not so many manuscripts. But the focus was not on the earliest form of the text, but on the standard text, on the liturgical text, or on the ecclesiastical text. Yeah. Okay, so
and what is very also important, that Antoniadis, his text continues the Byzantine tradition, but the critical editions published by Bible Society, they don't have an idea to publish the text that is the continuation. Their goal was to restore the oldest version of the New Testament. So, and this is the difference between these two.
There are
texts.
two different methods. So we are searching after the living text, so to say, if it's correct, I don't know, or after a Byzantine text type, and the critical editions of the Göttingen or Ralph's edition are searching for the earliest form. Yes.
A little more idea. I mean, you said, you asked whether or not there is okay to use the Prophetologion in translation of the Bible. And this is exactly what Antimus said when he published the Book of Hours in the services, including Psalms. He always improved the translation of the Psalms, which would be natural because he was a translator. I mean, this is the same part of the Bible. If you find it in the Book of Hours or in the Bible, it's the same translation. I mean, the same work. Of course, you can use every one of them for the other.
Okay, thank you very much for this discussion. Let us say that the conclusion is unconcluded, and that our quest could gain some arguments. Thank you, Professor Mary MacRobert. Thank you, Professor Sysse Engberg. Thank you, everybody, for joining our discussion. And let us see what the result would be later.
Amin.